Okay, we'll make a start. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us at 10 a.m. on the second day of Wide Days. So here we go with a 15-minute presentation for you. So I think this is the first of the presentations happening in this room today. So my name is Cooke. I'm the founder and managing director of a company called CMU. And with me is Annabella Coldrick from the Music Managers Forum. And what we're going to talk to you about in this presentation is the ongoing economics of streaming work that has been happening behind the scenes for a few years now in the UK. And in particular, the work that an organization called the Council of Music Makers has been doing as part of that ongoing conversation. So I thought we would begin by getting Annabella to say hello, introduce herself, but also explain what the Council of Music Makers is. So that's where we're going to begin.
Hi, yes, I'm Chief Executive of the Music Managers Forum, one of the logos on this board. We have about 1,500 nearly music managers in our membership who only earn money if they're artists or they're producers or they're mixers or they're musicians or their songwriters are earning money. And so we all sit on the UK Music Board, so the MMF, the Featured Artists Coalition, that's our sister organisation, the Ivors Academy that represents songwriters, and that's all songwriters, whether they be performing artists or writing for film and TV, the Music Producers Guild, and the Musicians Union. So altogether, all 5 organisations are about half of the UK Music Board. The other half are made up of rights holders, so the BPI that represents record labels, AIM that represents independent music rights holders, PPL and PRS, the collecting societies, and the Music Publishers MPA Association, remembering all my acronyms. So I guess the whole point of this long story with lots of acronyms is half of the organisation that represents British music to government, half of them represent the rights holders, and about half are the interests of the people who are making the music. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of stuff we agree on. For example, the importance of music education or the importance of copyright. But there's some stuff we don't agree on or where our priorities are different. And in particular, when it comes to music streaming, we all agreed that we needed to close the value gap and make sure that the user upload services, whether it be YouTube or TikTok or Facebook, all pay appropriately and properly through to rights holders and through to artists. But we can't agree on how the music that is paid over to rights holders is divided up back with the people who made the music. And particularly, as we'll come on to with Chris, for those artists who might be on older contracts, who might have signed their contracts pre-streaming, who feel they may be not getting a fair share of that ginormously expanding pie that's been growing every year from streaming revenue. So we founded the CMM. The CMM's got 5 sides to represent the 5 organisations. Joe and my team designed the logo. That was sort of the concept of the, is that Pentagon? Pentagon 5 sides?
Yeah, I imagine.
Yeah, right, okay. So that's the CMM, and it was back in about 2018. We've been meeting really, really regularly as part of as Chris said, a very old group called Artists, Managers, Performers, which was the MMF as the managers, the featured artists as the artists, and the Musicians Union as essentially the musicians who might not be artists, they might be touring musicians or recording musicians. And so we've been meeting really regularly. We've been talking about what we saw as injustices within the industry. We realised we very much needed to have the songwriters and the producers in there with us, and that was the birth of the CMM, which we think was 2018. And as Chris will come on to explain, since then there's been a whole big campaign, partly instigated by Tom Gray, but also through evidence by the amazing work that Chris Cooke's done for the Music Managers Forum on the digital dollar reports, and that has kind of led to a campaign within government and parliament that the CMM's very much been at the front of.
Yeah, so although the Council of Music Maker organisations come together on a number of issues in the music industry, and as Annabella said, sometimes actually they agree with the labels, the publishers, the streaming services, the societies, and the industry does speak as one. But there are those issues where there is the split between the music makers and the more sort of corporate end of the industry, and that's what the Council of Music Makers is for, although a lot of the attention, specifically over the last couple of years, has been around what has been named the economics of streaming debate. And this all became very political during the pandemic, and then the government in the UK instigated some work that's now been ongoing for 18 months. And the Council of Music Makers have very much come together on representing music makers in that work, because actually, once we went through all the various different issues that were part of this debate, it became very clear that artists, writers, producers, musicians, and their managers pretty much agree on everything. So rather than having 5 organizations all going in and presenting an opinion, it's like, okay, we should enter a united opinion. So let me just give you a very speedy, because we've only got 15 minutes in total, a very speedy recap of the economics of streaming debate so far. So let's start off by reminding ourselves that despite sometimes the narrative being streaming doesn't make any money, streaming makes a lot of money. And for the record industry, this is the recorded music business, streaming is now by far the biggest revenue stream coming in to the entire record industry. So that's labels, distributors, artists, musicians, their collecting societies, etc. All the stuff coming to the record industry, streaming is by far the biggest revenue stream. So the color scheme here, this is record industry figures from the IFPI. You'll see the slow decline of physical in the red, although actually, look, it's going back up. That's the vinyl revival for you. You'll see in the green how we had that, where downloads became a big thing, the iTunes store, and then it all went into decline. And the sort of turquoisey blue in the middle, that's the streaming boom. And what you'll notice is that these bars are going up. The record industry is in growth because of streaming. So that's great, and that's something that the entire industry can unite on. It's great that streaming is bringing in all this money. It's great the record industry is back in growth. The question is, how is that money being shared out? How is that money going across the system? Because streaming is ultimately a revenue share business. Companies like Spotify share their revenue every month, whether that's subscription revenue or ad revenue, with their music industry partners. So their direct partners are labels and distributors when it comes to recorded music, and publishers and collecting societies when it comes to the song side of the business. And then labels and distributors then share the money with the artists and the musicians, and the publishers and societies with the songwriters and the composers. So how is the money being shared? How does it flow down the system? What are the issues? There are quite a lot of issues. And actually, as Annabella mentioned, I've been working with the MMF for like 8 years now on a project called Dissecting the Digital Dollar that outlines all of the various different issues. There's a book you can buy which goes through it all in quite some detail. But this became a much bigger news story during the pandemic. So this is a chart that shows the different revenue streams. So we've got recorded music in the dark blue, songs, music publishing in the light blue, and then live in the gray. And so you can see the pandemic there, can't you? When the live industry just collapses overnight. And a lot of artists, live was a really important revenue stream. And the merchandise they sold at shows was a really important revenue stream. Plus, some artists make money out of education stopped. Some artists make money in the studios closed down. So it was, for a lot of artists, the pandemic was really, really bad news. Yet many of those artists have music that's streaming. And they were saying, well, hang on a second, the record industry was not affected by the pandemic. In revenue terms, the streaming money continued to rise. But for a lot of artists, they weren't seeing much of that money coming through because the way streaming set up, the deals that they've done in the past, they were getting a minority share of that money. So this was not a new observation. People have been talking about this for years, but suddenly this became a big political story. So Tom Gray had his Broken Record campaign, the Ives Academy and the MU had a fixed streaming campaign, the MMF and the FAC were building on the Dissecting the Digital Dollar work. And on the back of that, the Select Committee in the UK Parliament in London instigated an inquiry into the economics of streaming. Everybody in the industry inputted, including all 5 of the members of the Council of Music Makers. And in 2021, they published a report which called for a complete reset of the streaming business. They said the artists are right, there are a number of issues, the songwriters are right, there's a number of issues, and we should do something about it. And the MPs on that committee said, we could rewrite copyright law. Not all the issues could be solved with a rewrite of copyright law, but maybe some of them could. So they said, we should rewrite copyright law. Now, the Select Committee doesn't actually have any power. All they can do is put pressure on government. And so what government said is, you're right, there are issues. You're right, we need to solve them. You're right, a rewrite of copyright law might help. But before we do that, or consider that, we want the industry to see if they can solve this themselves. And so the government instigated a committee called the Music Industry Contact Group. They commissioned a bunch of research on the various different copyright reforms that have been proposed. And they convened working groups to specifically look at the issues of transparency and data. Meanwhile, the competition regulator, the CMA, undertook its own study. It agreed there were all these issues with streaming, but concluded, somewhat controversially in the music maker community, that it wasn't a competition law issue, it was a copyright law issue, and so they bounced it back to the IPO. So where we're currently at is These working groups have been going on for 18 months now. The work is ongoing, but hopefully, if we're feeling optimistic, what we're going to get out of that process is a couple of codes where everybody in the industry comes up and says, okay, we're going to step up when it comes to transparency. We're going to step up when it comes to data. We're not going to get everything the music makers want or think should happen, but maybe we get some steps in the right direction around transparency and metadata. Although it has to be said, on the biggest issue for artists, how the money is shared, this research has been commissioned, but there hasn't actually been a working group conversation like there has been for transparency and data. So for the music makers now, it's like, okay, we've done some work on transparency and data. We didn't get everything we wanted, but there's some steps in the right direction. But what about remuneration? So all of this work is ongoing, and a couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting in government where the relevant ministers came along to find out how all of this was progressing. And just ahead of that, the Council of Music Makers set out 5 key objectives for this work. And it was the first time the Council of Music Makers had presented its position in such a concise list. And so we're now going to go through, and Annabella's going to explain each of the 5 things that the Council of Music Makers believe we should be urgently prioritizing as part of this process.
And I think the thing to add is this is what we see as an alternative to regulation. We think regulation still very much needs to be on the table. In the absence of the music industry adopting, say, this 5-point plan, we feel that there needs to be the backup of whether that be a reversion right for artists to be able to legally get their rights back after a fixed period of time, the introduction of, what do they call it? Not the bestseller course, contract adjustment, which is a right that they have in other European countries under the Copyright Directive, which is the ability to have your contract reviewed against modern equitable terms. So say you signed a deal in 1980 and your royalty rate was 8%, you'd be able to go back to a tribunal and say, actually, we know from the streaming inquiry that 26% is a modern digital rate, so I shouldn't be being paid 8%. And the final one is equitable remuneration, which sounds like a mouthful, but is essentially what happens on broadcast radio. So artists are paid on broadcast radio, performers are paid regardless of what record deal they signed. So they're all things that would require legal changes. This is our proposal that if this is a way to avoid legal changes. This is a way to avoid having to go all the way through Parliament and make changes to copyright law. We're saying, come on, industry, step up, do the responsible thing, follow the 5-point plan, and then we'll stop campaigning for regulation. So that's the context.
And so here we go with the first of the 5.
Yeah, and we think all these things are really kind of the corporate responsible things that any industry should be doing. And it's interesting, I worked in other sectors years ago. I worked for Cadbury, and they're signed up to kind of fair trade principles about how they treat their suppliers, but the music industry isn't. So challenge number 1, we feel that all artists should receive a modern minimum digital royalty rate, have their unrecouped balances written off after a term on a rolling basis without any additional conditions. We didn't define a modern minimum digital royalty rate, as I say. It's in the Competition and Markets Authority report. It's also in the evidence given by the major labels to government that it's somewhere between 23 and 26% for new artists on major label royalty type deals. Beggars, it's quite known that beggars pay a 25% minimum digital royalty. All 3 major labels have said they will now disregard unrecouped balances prior to 2000. But only Sony has said that that's on a rolling basis. So Sony has said we'll keep rolling that forward, so it will eventually become 2001, 2002, 2003 as time moves forward. Universal and Warner, to my knowledge, I think 2000 is still the cut-off date because they say anything pre-2000 was pre-digital. That's their sort of logic for it. But they're not writing off these unrecouped balances, they're disregarding them, which means they could reapply them. So if you potentially audit your label or if you try and sell your copyrights to a Hypnosis or one of the many others, they can then reapply your unrecouped balance. So this is why we say without any additional conditions. And as we say, we didn't define it as 23 or 26% or whatever. We'd like the industry to come to a standard, as I understand they do in some other markets, but that might change over time. So in 10, 15 years' time, it might be 30, 35% might be the modern digital royalty rate, and we don't think it should be fixed at a point in the past.
For each of these, the Council of Music Makers has basically given a mark out of 5 as to where they think the industry is in terms of the conversations that are going on behind the scenes. So in terms of this one, because the majors and most independents are now paying through on unrecouped balances, that there has been a little bit of progress in this domain. Some indies do already apply the minimum royalty rate. Some indies already pay significantly more than what that minimum rate would be, but there hasn't been an industry-wide commitment on the rate, and it's not even being discussed at the moment within the government work. So it's a 1 out of 5 on this. Okay, we're going to speed through these because we've got to fit in our slot. But number 2.
Number 2, session musicians should see the benefit of the streaming boom on both new recordings and catalogue. This is something the MU has been campaigning for. Obviously, if you introduced a form of equitable remuneration, as is the case on radio, all session musicians see what is quite a small payout, but they do see a small payout every time the music they worked on is played on the radio. Their rates agreed with the BPI, I think, haven't changed for the last, is it 7 or 8 years, Chris? It's something like that. So the MU at the moment is renegotiating the session fees with the BPI. They feel very strongly, and we support, that session musicians should see some impact and some payback from the streaming boom, both on the new recordings but also on the catalogue. Obviously, for a new recording, you can negotiate, you can get a higher session fee, but if you recorded on a track years ago, which is being played a lot on streaming, maybe less on radio nowadays, your income, you're not seeing that payback.
So although the BPI and the MU are talking about renegotiating the session agreement, the MU feels that when it comes to achieving this on streaming, not a lot has been achieved as yet, and it's not currently part of the government conversation. So unfortunately, it's a 0 out of 5 on that at the moment. This is something you alluded to in that this is one of the copyright law reforms, but the idea is that actually a voluntary commitment could be made on this, which would be more flexible than actually sticking it into copyright law.
And as we said, adopting a minimum digital royalty rate would be one way of achieving this, but there may be other outdated contract terms, which, for 20, 30 years ago, there should be the ability to revise those. And to be fair, if you're a successful artist and you're renegotiating, you probably do have an ability to revisit some of those contract terms, but you might have performed in a band in the 90s who did very well at the time, you since split up, and you're not seeing anything for your streaming because you at least you would now be, you wouldn't be recouped, but you might have your balance disregarded, but you might still be on a very, very low royalty rate. You might still have TV advertising deductions being applied, which I know sounds unbelievable, but I understand is the case. If artists challenge it, often the labels will back down, but they won't do it proactively. They'll only do it if you challenge it. So anyone who represents artists, what's called, I don't know whether it's a good word or not, heritage, legacy artists, anyone who represents artists in that space, should at the very least try and challenge those now, because the labels know there's a spotlight on them and that they need to do the right thing.
So in terms of the government conversations, in terms of this being a voluntary solution rather than a change to copyright law, so far not been discussed. Number 4 brings us to the transparency side.
Yes, so this hopefully should be addressed through the transparency code that we're all working on, that Chris has put innumerable hours into sitting down and going through in detail. This is the right that we feel that artists and songwriters should have the right to know how their money is being monetized by each digital platform. You might say, well, that's really obvious. We know Spotify's a rev share from all the work done through Chris through the digital dollar, but actually on Spotify's own website, they're quite open about the fact that they look at how many streams they've been in a month. They divide that up by the rights holders and the total pot of money, and then they pay the rights holders on that basis. So it's a revenue share model. However, there's a lot of streaming services which aren't on a revenue share model. For example, TikTok is not on a revenue share model. It's a flat fee that's paid in advance or on an interim basis to the rights holders. Meta, so what was Facebook, paid $1 billion to the music industry, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, without any data. They said, here's $1 billion, let us experiment with music. And we then had to go around all the major labels and Merlin for the indies and say, well, how are you going to share up your share of the $1 billion? And they're all doing it slightly differently. Some of them are using YouTube as a proxy, so they're saying, well, we've got no idea what music's on Facebook, but hey, we know we've got some data from YouTube, so we'll just sort of split it up on the same basis and pay it over. Some were saying, oh, no, that's not right, we should use a mixture of Spotify and YouTube. Obviously, TikTok has come in since then. It's massive, albeit only for short clips, but we feel that both the platforms and the rights holders should proactively communicate how money is allocated to the songs and recordings, because obviously it's not just the recordings, and then how they pay through. If
the Transparency Working Group code that's currently being negotiated is agreed, as the Council of Music Makers would like it, then we do actually feel we're going to make some progress on this, although that is TBC because there's still negotiations going on. It could be that once the final code is on the table, it goes back down to 2 or maybe even 1.
And to be fair, the publishers say that it's very complicated. They don't want to share any of this data proactively. They'll only do it on request. And even if we do get the code through, there are some bits that Chris and I are pushing very strongly on things like audit rights and the ability to get proper samples of your artist data. The labels are saying, oh, it's too complicated, there's too much data.
So even if the code gets through, we'll still have at least 2 out of 5 to achieve. And finally, we are kind of out of time. This is the one I talked about on this stage a year ago, and it takes a whole day to explain what's going on here. But basically, there are big issues around music rights data that stop songwriters in particular from getting paid. And there's some proposals, baby steps in terms of addressing this. The MMF has a whole report called the Song Royalties Manifesto that goes through all of this in much more detail. But a little bit of progress, providing the code that's being negotiated goes through, that will not fix things.
No, it certainly won't fix things, but we hope there's a big black box of money where publishing, they don't know who published the songs or who wrote the songs, and so at the moment, that money is held for a certain amount of time and then paid over on a market share to the current rights holders. So if you represent an artist and you've been releasing music and doing really well, but you haven't properly registered your songs, you're not being paid that money is being paid, it's just not being paid to your artist as the songwriter. It's going into the black box and being claimed by other people essentially within the system. So, and I was going to say, even if it is registered properly, if it's under a threshold, you still might not get the money. So we want it to be as quick and accurate as it is for artists.
So those are the 5 foundational changes that the Council of Music Makers is pushing for. I think you'll probably all agree that they're actually pretty basic requests. These are not radical proposals. If you are a member of any one of those organizations, then you can be part of this process through the Ivors Academy if you're a songwriter, the MMF if you're a manager, the FAC if you're an artist, the MU if you're a musician, the MPG if you're a producer, because all of this is led by the members of those organizations. And they will keep you updated, as will the Council of Music Makers through its own social media, on what happens in the next couple of months. Do we get it that we do get 2 out of 5 on data, 3 out of 5 on transparency, or do they go down a little bit at the final step? And then, of course, as I think you can see from all the hollow circles on these slides, there's still quite a lot of work to be done. So I don't think anyone's going to stop working on that. We are out of time. You can download those slides if you want from this webpage. And we're going to get out of the way because there's another presentation starting here at 10:30. But both me and Annabella are around for the rest of the day. So if you have any questions, come and grab us, and we'll try and answer them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.